When you're using interceptors in Coldbox, you make what's called an interceptor declaration. It's a fancy name for a couple of settings in your Coldbox CFC file, and they look like what you see at the top of the screen here. You give each interceptor a unique name. This part is technically optional, but it's highly recommended, and you specify a class path that points to whichever CFC has your interceptor in it. Remember, an interceptor is just a function that's named a specific way. And you can also specify a property structure, like you see on the bottom of our screen, that holds any config data you want passed into the interceptor when it's called. You can have as many interceptors in your app as you want, just make sure that they all have unique names so none of the code collides together as they're running. Instead of using the Coldbox CFC to set up an interceptor declaration, you can also activate your interceptors by registering them with code. There's a file called interceptor service that comes with Coldbox for this very purpose. Interceptor service has a method in it called register interceptor that you can call from your application. And it takes basically the same arguments that your Coldbox CFC uses for setting up the interceptors. Here you can see the interceptor service CFC. You don't actually change any code in here. This is the functionality provided for you by Coldbox. Here's our Coldbox config file, and you can see I have my interceptor in here called myInterceptor. Here's my myInterceptor CFC file. It's got an interceptor in it called post event. So this interceptor runs after any event in my application. And it's really a simple one here. It's just going to output the content post event was called to the screen. I'm going to go back here to my browser, run our app, and you can see the text post event was called gets outputted to the screen because that interceptor is actually running. So that's doing it the Coldbox config way. Let's go back here to our code. I'm going to open up my Coldbox config file and I'm going to comment out that interceptor. Save it. Now, we're going to reload Coldbox. Going back here to our browser, $fw re init equals 1. It's now reloaded Coldbox, and you can see that post event message is no longer on the screen because the interceptor has been deactivated. Now let's go back to our code one more time. I'm going to close my Coldbox config file and go to our messages list event handler. Here's the list function that's running. You can see it's just grabbing data out of our database and drawing it into the view as we expect it to. At the top of this file, I've got a property tag here, and you can see I'm injecting the interceptor service straight from Coldbox. Coldbox is the namespace. We're saying go into the Coldbox namespace of our application, grab the thing called interceptor service, and inject it into a variable or property called interceptor service I can use here in my handler. And then down here in my list function, I can call this code, interceptor service.register interceptor, and I'm going to pass it the same name that I used in my Coldbox config file. Interceptors is the name of the folder, and my interceptor is the CFC. You can see over here in my interceptors folder, there's my interceptor. That's the file we looked at earlier. So now it's got the post event item in there. Now let's go back to our browser, and I've still got fw reinit in the URL, so I can use that to reload Coldbox, and you can see our interceptor is now active again. So I got the same functionality both ways. I can either add the interceptors in the Coldbox config file, or if you have maybe a more complicated application where you want to add and remove interceptors at runtime as different things happen in the application, you can do that as well by doing these two steps. Inject interceptor service with a property tag, and then simply call the register interceptor method, pointing it to the CFC with your interceptor inside it. So we know how to register an interceptor in our application. What if you want to undo that and unregister an interceptor so it stops firing as your application is running? There are a couple of ways you can do that with runtime functionality via code. First is if you're inside your interceptor CFC, and that's where you want to do this, you can simply call unregister and pass it the name of the event that you no longer want to listen for. You can also use the interceptor service that we looked at earlier and call the unregister method inside there. Pass it the name of your interceptor and which event or state it is that you want to stop listening to. Save and reload your application, and that will take care of the rest. In the interceptor CFC, you have an optional configure method. This runs just before your interceptor method runs. As the name implies, it can be used to configure things specific to your interceptor in this CFC. Configure is an optional method. You don't have to use it if you don't need it. The method can be totally empty, or you can leave it out of the CFC entirely if you want. The interceptors will still fire correctly even without it. You'll see this configure naming convention and standard used in other spots within the Coldbox ecosystem as well. When you get into doing things like writing modules, and if you write your own command box commands and that sort of thing, this concept of a configure method will pop up again and again. So even if you don't use it in your interceptors, keep it in the back of your mind for later because it does pop up in other facets of Coldbox development. Just like JavaScript has its on-click, on-mouse over, and so forth, there are Coldbox events that work the same way. They happen when different things within the Coldbox app occur. And if you've got an interceptor listening for that event, the code will run. Here in the Coldbox documentation, you can find the different lifecycle events available to you. If you've ever worked with other event-driven things, including JavaScript, the concept here is basically the same, even if the names of the events are somewhat different. Basically, you can have code run automatically when your app starts up, when your app shuts down, before or after any events within your app, when a new user's session is created, lots of similar things to the application CFC file, but on a Coldbox level, and with the various other Coldbox specific events available to you as well. Any of these event names here in the docs, that's what you would name the interceptor. So see where it says after configuration load, after aspects load, pre-reinit, on exception, and so on. Those would be the things that you actually name your functions in your interceptor. So if you want one to fire before any event runs, meaning the pre-event lifecycle hook, for instance, you would name your method pre-event. If you want some code to fire when a new user session is created, then you would name the method session start, as you'll find that also in the documentation here. And if you want both of those things to happen, just make both methods in your CFC. You can have as many interceptors in one CFC as you'd like, and you can have as many CFCs that are interceptors as you'd like as well. Don't forget to reload Coldbox when you add your new event interceptor so the changes get picked up. That's important. Let's take a look at some code and look at this in a little more detail. Here I've got my post-event interceptor running, and it's just outputting some text to the screen, which isn't really a great way to use interceptors, but it will be obvious that the code is running, so for our purposes of this demo, it'll be okay. Post-event runs after any event in my application. You can see here it ran after my messages list event, which is the page we're on now. In fact, I'm going to get rid of that fwreinit in the URL, just so that it doesn't look like I'm doing any trickery there. Now we've got messages list with nothing else in the URL, and you can see post-event is still running how we expect it to. Notice how even though it ran after the event, the text didn't appear at the bottom of our page. Yet another good piece of evidence that I'm doing things a little bit on the quick and dirty side here. If you really need an interceptor to output some content, you can use the buffer variable that gets passed in, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this particular lesson. We'll come back to that later. For most apps, people start using interceptors to do things like basic security. If you need to make sure a user is logged in before they can access some specific events, you could throw security logic into an interceptor, reload your application, and have that functionality available. Back to our demo purposes here. So post-event is running, and when I click on the message details page, you can see the post-event is also running there. So it's running after any event in our application, not just things specific to message list. If I go to the users list or users details, you would see the post-event was called at the top of those pages as well. The interceptor is not handler specific. It'll run on any handler in our app, messages, users, any other handlers we have. It will run anywhere we want it to run in our entire application. In addition to those application lifecycle events I just showed you, there are a bunch more events you can use as you wish. They're all listed here in the core interception points section of the Coldbox documentation. And as you can see, they can get really specific and detailed. Go over here to the application section. There are events for when an exception is thrown in your app, when an invalid event is fired, when your application ends, when sessions start and end, similar to your application CFC, pre-processing, pre-event, when you want code to run after an event, post-processing. There are events for object creation, after your handler creates something, after instances are created of different things in your app through Wirebox. You can have events for layouts, before and after your layout files are rendered in your application, before and after views are rendered in your application. There are a whole bunch of different events that can be either global and happen at a high level, like when your application first starts up or when it shuts down, or you can have events that fire really, really specific points in time, before and after a view renders, before and after a layout renders, and that sort of thing. As your applications grow in complexity, you may find more uses for interceptors, but if you don't need them much in your code, if it's a smaller or maybe medium-sized app, that can be expected that you won't be using interceptors very often. Interceptors are another awesome but totally optional feature from Coldbox, so use them if you would benefit from them in some way in your application, and you can skip them if you don't have a need for them to do some sort of custom functionality in your application. You may find you'll do more injecting of things, and possibly other third-party modules that you add into your application, those might have their own interceptors in them that do something. That happens from time to time as your apps grow in size, but again, don't worry too much about interceptors. Understand the concepts of them at a high level and how they work. If you write an application that doesn't end up using all of these different event life cycles in your interceptors, that's totally normal. They're here if you need them, and if you don't need them, skip them. You can find out more about interceptors here at the coldbox.ortusbooks.com documentation.